Welcome to the KUASIA Symposium, Pan-Asianism and Beyond, the Past, Present, and Future of Inter-Asian Connections. This symposium is organized by Koch University's Center for Asian Studies with the support of the Japan Foundation. And I am the center's co-director, Aiko Takeuchi Demerji, and I will be moderating the sessions along with co-director Burak Birel. So this symposium builds upon the concept of Pan-Asianism, and that has been studied by many scholars over the past few decades. Pan-Asianism as a historical ideology emerged in the 19th century in response to the impending threat of the West, and has been later co-opted in the political rhetoric of Japanese imperialism. But the idea of people and countries in Asia coming together under a type of regionalism has remained relevant on many levels and in various fields, and it seems all the more important to revisit historical events and discussions leading up to the present in order to make sense of current conversations on new Asianism or Asian regionalism in a different political climate and changing dynamics of the world. So having an institution in Turkey host this international event is meaningful, I believe, and actually, another workshop on Japan and Pan-Asianism was hosted by KUASIA University a while ago. Not only because it highlights Turkey's place in these historical conversations on Pan-Asianism, but also because we are able to bring together scholars from various parts of the world who contribute to much broader understandings about Asia. So today, as you see in the program, we have scholars based in Japan, Turkey, and Europe, looking at these inter-Asian connections from various angles, whether through personal accounts that have not been highlighted in official diplomatic history, or domestic reforms carried out by Pan-Asianists, or cultural expressions about Asian connections that might not necessarily have been articulated as Pan-Asianism, or ideas about Pan-Asianism that manifested themselves after World War II in international relations. So the original plan was to invite the speakers today to this beautiful city of Istanbul and the campus of Koç University. And we actually have been waiting for a while to see it will be safe enough to bring guests from abroad, but unfortunately, it seems like we have to be patient for a little while. But so for now, please enjoy the view of our campus from the screen that you see right now. But doing this online, I think, has its own benefits and conveniences, and actually doing international meetings nowadays have never been easier, as long as you get the time zone differences correct. But we hope that someday in the near future, we will be able to have an in-person meeting here in Istanbul on another occasion. So without further ado, I would like to introduce first quickly the schedule of the program and of the next 2 days, and pass the floor to our first speakers. So this this morning, we will start with Sven Saaler and Christopher Spillman, who will talk about this, a broader introduction about the concept of Pan-Asianism that would lead to today. And then in the afternoon, we have Selçuk Esenbel, Erdal Yalçın, and Miyuki Aoki Giradelli, who will talk about these individuals who traveled across the Asian continent to spread and share ideas about Asia. And then tomorrow in the morning, tomorrow we will start 1 hour earlier. We have Christopher Lemon and Seiko Mimaki, who will talk about Pan-Asianism from the perspective of international relations, especially after World War II. And then finally, in the afternoon, we have Ozan Nergis Dolce Roca and Esra Gokce Shahin, and myself, Aiko Takeuchi Demerji, who will talk about this inter-Asian connections from the cultural perspective. So, and there will be an hour break between the morning and afternoon sessions. And during that time, we will close the meeting briefly, but you can re-enter using the same link for that day. And for tomorrow, therefore, please use a separate link to enter the symposium. And in each session, we will first have the speakers talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then followed by a Q&A from the floor. And you will be muted, the guests will be muted during the talks, but you may open your microphone during the Q&A session or post your questions in the Q&A box or the chat box at any time. And the symposium will be recorded partially, and the recordings will be available through the KUASIA YouTube channel. So first, let me introduce our first speaker. Sven Saaler is a professor of modern Japanese history at Sophia University in Tokyo. After earning a PhD in Japanese studies and history from Bonn University, he held positions at Marburg University, the German Institute for Japanese Studies in Tokyo, and the University of Tokyo. He's author of Politics, Memory, and Public Opinion in 2005, Man in Metal, a topography of public bronze statuary in modern Japan, 2020, as well as co-author and co-editor of Pan-Asianism in Modern Japanese History, 2007, The Power of Memory in Modern Japan, 2008, Pan-Asianism, A Documentary History, 2011, and the Routledge Handbook of Modern Japanese History in 2018. So let me first close my screen. And with that, Sven, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Aiko, for the nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you also for organizing this conference. As you said, it would have been nice to meet in person, but in addition to the pandemic, we have additional problems now. So I guess it was much safer to hold this symposium online. Thank you also to Koch University for hosting us, and to the Japan Foundation for supporting this symposium. Let me share my screen presentation. I assume you can see the presentation. Yeah. Okay, so in my presentation today, I would like to define some of the characteristics of historical Pan-Asianism and point out how this ideology has remained an influential current of thought throughout Asia from the 19th to the 21st century. I hope to connect some of the dots in the development of Pan-Asian ideas over a long term. I hope to be able today in my presentation to define some of the characteristics of Pan-Asianism and point out how this ideology remained an influential current of thought from the late 19th until into the 21st century. I am particularly happy to be here today because it was almost exactly 20 years ago when we had a conference on Pan-Asianism in Tokyo, which was also supported by the Japan Foundation. So if somebody from Japan Foundation is listening, thank you again. In retrospect, I think this was a very productive conference, which resulted in a number of publications, some of which Aiko has already mentioned. The book Pan-Asianism in Modern Japanese History, which, as the title indicates, focused on Japan, was one of the first books ever on explicitly taking up Pan-Asianism as an ideology. And then we followed up with a 2-volume set of primary sources published together with my colleague Christopher Spillman, who will be the next speaker, in 2011. 20 years ago, when we started this project, I was not sure whether the topic would be of interest to anybody, but in retrospective, I'm happy to see that a number of studies have come out since, both in Japanese and in English. Some of these studies widened the focus in time and in space, such as the studies by our colleague Brij Tanka on India. We also now have books analyzing the role of Pan-Asianism in Japanese-Philippines relations. Last year was again a very good year for the study of Pan-Asianism. Our colleague Craig Smith finally published his book on Chinese Asianism. This is, I think, supposed to be a new standard work, which is very helpful because our research has very much focused on Japan. Here we now have a very in-depth analysis of the role of Pan-Asianism or Asianism in Chinese discussions. We have an additional edited volume on Pan-Asianism in Sino-Indian relations, and a study on Kenkoku University, a Japanese colonial university with a very strong Pan-Asian character. So all of these books came out last year. So I think this is a very timely conference, and I think it is obvious that interest in Asianism or Pan-Asianism is continuing. The value of this research on Pan-Asianism is, above all, I think, that it contributes to a balance of the approach of nation-centered historiography on the one side, and the sometimes a little bit exaggerated aspirations of what is called global history on the other, by focusing on the region, by focusing on Asia. Of course, global history is very important as a current in historiography, but sometimes it is very difficult to practice. And I think that's where the focus on a region comes in a very helpful way. Methodologically, I think some of the research that I just introduced has emphasized also that it is important to not consider Pan-Asianism exclusively a part of the field of intellectual history or even philosophy, but that it also needs to be a part of the research on the history of international relations. And that is what I want to talk about mainly today in my presentation. When I use the term ideology in this context, and I noticed Aiko was also using it in her introduction, some of you might be reminded of a classical piece on Pan-Asianism from the 1960s, also written by a scholar with the name of Takeuchi, which claims that Pan-Asianism is not a clearly defined ideology, but merely a tendency in discourse, merely a tendency. This was really a sentence that made me very nervous in the early stages of my research, but I think in the meantime, in my own research, I have shown that this is too simplistic and that there are writings that quite clearly define what Pan-Asianism is, and that clearly construct Pan-Asianism as a concrete set of ideas. I don't want to repeat what I have already published and written before. So if you want to know more about that, please refer to my 2007 article, The Construction of Regionalism, in which I elaborate on that point. On top of that, we also should not forget that most ideologies, of course, evolve over time. They combine with others, and hardly any ideology is 100% clear-cut and self-contained. Some socialists, obviously, at the same time are internationalists. Some are even nationalists. Some of those are national socialists, and most national socialists would be racist, and therefore I take Pan-Asianism as an ideology, one that often combines with others, but has a clearly defined core of its own. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hope it's holding. This core of Pan-Asian ideology, as we have defined it in our books, include such themes as cultural unity, a common culture, or shared cultural roots, something that would also include linguistic commonalities. We often encounter an emphasis on the spiritual character of Asian civilization, as opposed in a very binary way, often with the supposedly non-spiritual or material character of Western civilization. We often see an emphasis on historical interconnectedness within the region. Pan-Asian discourse often is characterized by a strong racial or even racialist, if not racist dimension. We frequently hear arguments about economic unity and integration, or at least of the necessity thereof. And very importantly, we often see Pan-Asian writers referring to a common future, to a common destiny of some kind. As historians, if we deal with a specific subject, that of course means, first of all, that we have to find concrete evidence in the sources to show that something, in this case, an ideology, actually existed and that it was relevant. And then historians move on to explain the historical context in which this ideology developed. If we analyze the relevance of an ideology, then obviously we look for concrete manifestations, for concrete mention of the ideology, whether in a literal or non-literal sense. Not always is the specific term used in case of Asianism, but we have a number of slogans and terms that indicate Pan-Asian orientations. Such evidence obviously would be produced by specific agents. So first of all, let me say something about the agency behind Pan-Asian discourse. If we look at of Pan-Asianism, we look at a broad spectrum of philosophers, intellectuals, religious leaders, adventurers, professional activists, lobbyists, revolutionaries, politicians, and diplomats. And we have plenty of research by now on various forms of Pan-Asianism presented by these actors. But what is very important is that beyond individual agency, from the late 19th century onwards, we also see informal networks forming all over Asia. And then based on these initially informal networks, we also see Pan-Asian organizations formed in increasingly large numbers and proliferate all over the Asian continent. The majority of these organizations and the individuals joining them were not part of mainstream political discourse, but usually stood and still often do stand in opposition to the government in power. This is a facet that also characterizes Pan-Asian discourse and politics from the late 19th century into the 21st century. When government representatives shift towards a more Pan-Asian course, they often face opposition, and sometimes they are even overthrown, indicating that the idea of a united Asia is actually rather divisive. As an example, in 2009, in a very famous story, for example, the Japanese cabinet of Hatoyama Yukio announced a slight and only partial pivot to Asia and was, as a result, brought down. So we can see Asianism, even in the 21st century, or some kind of Pan-Asian orientation, still remains a very divisive issue. But let me give you some examples of Pan-Asian organizations that are considered representative of the development, the historical development of Pan-Asianism. One of the first Pan-Asian organizations seen as of some relevance is the KUASIA, usually translated as the Raising Asia or Race Asia Society. We already see in the name that it does not use the term Asianism or Pan-Asianism, which was not part of the political lexicon yet at that time when it was founded in 1880. It uses the slogan KOA, Raising Asia or Developing Asia, to express transnational feelings of Asian solidarity and as a sign of a claim for a common goal. This general characteristic of Pan-Asian discourse, this is a general characteristic of Pan-Asian discourse, that we find different slogans and not necessarily the term Asianism or Pan-Asianism used. And this is partly the reason for the fuzziness in the in research to grasp Pan-Asianism as an ideology. It is difficult to trace. Another important characteristic of the Asianism that the KUASIA exemplifies is that it is comprised mostly of anti-government figures, as I just explained. So in terms of its leading figures, some of which I have introduced here on the slide, we can see that some politicians with what seems to be a prestigious background joined the society, but none of them was a major player in national politics at the time, and none of them was involved in the decision-making of the government at the national level. The KUASIA was also an early example of an organization with a multinational membership. At least 66 members of this society were from outside of Japan, from China, Korea, but also the Ottoman Empire. And it received quite some positive coverage in these countries. For example, in Korea, the Korean envoy to Japan at the time wrote a report to the King of Korea in which he highly praised the society, the KUASIA. I don't want to read the whole quote, which you can find in an article on the KUASIA written by our colleague Viktor Tikhonov, but probably the most important passage is the one here in bold. So he writes, recently, gentlemen of lofty intentions came together to establish an organization under the name Race Asia Society. This society intends to bring together as many superior gentlemen from all Asian lands as possible in order to retrieve our declining fortunes and then together enjoy the great peace. It has already acquired altogether more than 300 members, among them scholars, peasants, artisans, and traders being represented. It includes both governmental officials and scholars, and also officials and subjects of China. I am also one of these members. So this is the Korean envoy writing to the Korean king, and I think particularly from today's perspective, this is quite an astonishing statement. Now, let me move on to my second example of an influential Pan-Asian society, the Toa-Do-Bunkai, or the East Asian Common Culture Society, which was much larger and also much more influential than the Koakai, partly because it had connections to the government, and partly also because the Koakai later actually emerged into this Toa-Do-Bunkai. It was founded in 1898, and the first president was came from a very prestigious family, Mr. Konoe Atsumaro. He was a very high-ranking aristocrat. But again, as in the case of the leading figures from the Koakai, he was a member of the House of Peers, which had more ceremonial functions and was not directly involved in the decision-making, in the day-to-day political decision-making processes. So again, this was an organization that had some connections to the government, mainly because of the role of Konoe Atsumaro. But at the end of the day, it generally challenged the government's foreign policy course, and it was in opposition to the government of the day. This was also expressed in Konoe's private activities. For example, he is very well known for an article he published with the title Alliance of the Yellow Race, which appeared in 1898 in the popular journal Taiyo. The title is a little bit longer, but basically the argument he is making here is that the yellow race shall unite and fight against Western white imperialism. So here we can see a shift from the discourse of development, which was underlying the Koakai. Koa means developing Asia, race Asia. We can see here a shift from this discourse of development towards a more racial discourse, which was, of course, a reply to the yellow peril propaganda popular around that time, particularly in certain circles in Germany, where Konoe Atsumaro actually had studied from 1885 to 1890. So he knew what he was talking about when he was speaking about European racism. While the Toa-Do-Bunkai was probably, as I said, the most famous Pan-Asian society, the most infamous society was the Kokuryukai, alternatively translated as Amur Society, expressing the society's anti-Russian agenda, or in a somewhat Orientalist tone, as Black Dragon Society. The society itself, however, we have to realize, frequently chose to instrumentalize visually the Black Dragon imagery. Here on the bottom right, you can see the cover of one of the journals the Kokuryukai published in the late 1910s and early 1920s. And you can see on the cover, you have a black dragon. I'm cutting short my comments on this society. I've published an article on this as well, and you can find more in other publications. So please refer to other publications here, and let me move on to China. So all of these organizations that I have introduced until now, which were founded between 1880 and 1900, were Japanese organizations. They were multinational and they had non-Japanese members, but there were organizations that were based in Japan and that mainly had Japanese members. However, the research of our colleague Craig Smith has shown that also in China, Pan-Asianism played an important role in discourse. And similar to Japan, large numbers of Pan-Asian societies were founded at certain points in time in China as well. or in Tokyo by Chinese exiles. Actually, the first Chinese Pan-Asian organization, so to say, was the Asian Brotherhood Society, which was founded in 1907 in Tokyo by Chinese exiles. But again, it had a multinational membership. Then in the mid-1920s, Pan-Asian organizations mushroomed all over China, partly resulting from the adoption of Pan-Asianism by the father of the Chinese Revolution, Sun Yat-sen. Here are just a few examples of Pan-Asian organizations founded in Chinese cities in the mid-1920s. As with the Japanese organizations, these organizations also were transnational in character. They had multinational membership, and they published multilingual publications such as the Eastern Miscellany or the journal New Asia. The founding of such organizations, both in China and in Japan, saw significant ups and downs, which were often related to the developments in mainstream politics and in international relations. In 1930s Japan, we see an astonishing return of the terminology of Koa, which triggered the foundations of dozens, if not hundreds, of new Pan-Asian organizations. The background to this was now a government decision, namely the government's gradual shift towards Pan-Asianism and the Tokyo government's gradual adoption of Pan-Asianism as a foreign policy guideline. In 1939, the government created an organization called the KUASIA, which was basically an organization on the rank of a ministry. In English, usually it's called the Asia Development Board. And this organization was partly responsible for policies in occupied China. This sparked an unprecedented wave of publications as well as organizational activity. There is a Koa boom in 1939, 1940, 41 that is totally off the charts. If we look at publications, for example, you can see from this that until 1938, the term Koa was only occasionally used in publications, and most of them actually would be publications about the 1880s, about the 1880 Koakai, and things that were written by 1880s Pan-Asianists. But after the foundation of the KUASIA, as you can see here, everybody went entirely crazy, so to say, about the term Koa, and everybody was enthusiastic to write about this new foreign policy paradigm. These are the number of books published according to the National Diet Library digital collection. Of course, this is not an absolute number, but I think it clearly indicates a tendency in political discussions. Pan-Asian organizations even considered it necessary to found roof organizations to coordinate the propagandistic efforts. The Dai Nihon Koa Dome, the Great Japan League for Raising Asia, which was a roof organization under which you had these more than 100 Pan-Asian organizations. Its foundation even figured in newsreels. I hope this is working. I hope you get the sound here. It is coming right up after this coverage of the wonderful measure of occupied Shanghai.
中国映画界のスター、金融賞を迎えて華やかなプール開きを行いました。ビーチパラソルまで持ち出して賑やかな共演プールには、彼女のファンは元よりのこと、多数のカッパレンが繰り出して、いとも賑やかな夏の除幕式でありました。
So this is the ceremony of the foundation of this great Japan League for Raising Asia. And in a moment here, you can see President General Matsui Iwane, whom some of you might know from a different context. Listening to his speech, you might doubt his enthusiasm for the cause of the KUASIA movement that he is proclaiming here. But until today, he is a very important figure in the historical memory of the history of KUASIA. He is, for example, venerated in a temple called KUASIA Canon in Odawara. This great Japan League for Raising Asia even had its own journal just for a few years, obviously, but it created a new journal titled just simply KUASIA, which had a very propagandistic character. And many of the articles are characterized by rather shallow and very repetitive rhetoric. This KUASIA boom again spilled back to China. In China again in late 1939 and 1940, we see new organizations, KUASIA organizations, being founded. This, of course, has to do with the founding of with the creation of a puppet regime in Nanjing under Wang Jingwei, the so-called reorganized national government, which very strongly advocated Pan-Asianism as one of the reasons why this puppet government cooperated with Japan. But also in the corporate world, you can find companies. Here on the left, you have advertisement of a company using the KUASIA slogan. We have exhibitions here on the right. You have the KUASIA exhibition held by, I think this was, at least one of them. There were several of these. One of them was held by Asahi Shimbun. And in quite a number of cases, we see the term, the propagandistic term KUASIA. Okay, so I think you heard me talking about exhibitions, and at least one of these exhibitions combined the term KUASIA with another very popular propaganda term from around that time, namely the term Holy War, Seisen, which was also used very intensively since the mid-1930s with respect to the war in China. So this is something that I think is quite important. And if you read previous research on Japan and the Holy War, it is usually limited to the war against the United States and Britain after December 1941, but actually Seisen was used quite intensively in the second half of the 1930s as a part of this Pan-Asian propaganda campaign to legitimize the war in China, not the war against the US and the UK. So yeah, so much for Pan-Asian organizations for the time being. In the remaining time, I would like to introduce a second indication of Pan-Asianism having some relevance in international relations, though not necessarily on the government level, namely Pan-Asian conferences, which are also a quite constant expression of Pan-Asian developments in foreign relations, in international relations. For example, these are not the first examples, but probably among the better known examples are the 1926-27 conferences held in Nagasaki and Shanghai and organized by the Pan-Asiatic Society. These were conferences on which representatives from Japan, China, India, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Turkey met and discussed avenues of Asian cooperation. In Nagasaki, 1926, they even proposed the foundation of an Asian League, a very ambitious goal that would never be realized. But these conferences were very important. They were only private enterprises, and they were watched with much suspicion by the national governments, but also, of course, by the colonial authorities from Southeast Asia. But they would also show that activists from all over Asia considered it necessary to meet and to plan for Asian unity. These conferences also would be reported quite intensively worldwide. Here we see some clippings from Japanese newspapers on the left, but also English-speaking newspapers from all over the world. And even you can find French coverage, you can find German coverage, Italian coverage, Spanish coverage. But the 1926 Nagasaki conference, here, for example, one article from a Canadian newspaper, which frames this conference and Pan-Asianism in general in the framework of a racial war, which was also a very common trope around that time. It frames this conference as a preparation of Asiatic races to drive to expel the whites from Asia. More famous are probably the wartime conferences that were held to serve Pan-Asian propaganda. Most of these conferences have, until recently, not been taken very seriously. They have been interpreted as mere propaganda exercises. More recent research has emphasized that there's a little bit more to that. Obviously, these were propagandistic exercises during World War II to legitimize the war, Japan's war, as a war to liberate Asia from Western colonialism. But I have looked recently a little bit more into detail into this 1942 KUA conference. This is a conference that was held in Manchukuo, in Manchuria, in the capital of Manchukuo, and it was a meeting of representatives of political organizations from Japan, Manchukuo, and the Wang Jingwei Chinese government in Nanjing. And on this conference, we can actually see that even the Japanese, and this was 1 year before the infamous 1943 Greater East Asian Conference, already on this conference in 1942, there were some skeptical and critical voices from within Japan that said, well, maybe all of this KUA propaganda is a little bit over the top, and we have real serious problems to communicate KUA propaganda to the people in China and Manchukuo. So there is a report from this conference, from this convention of Japanese, Manchurian, and Chinese KUA organizations, which clearly reveals a considerable lack of understanding for what KUA actually means, particularly in China and in Manchukuo, which were the core countries of what Japan considered a Pan-Asian bloc. Notwithstanding the assertion of the author of this report that the ideal of KUA is, and I quote, fully established, and that it is synonymous with holy war, Seizen, the spirit of the foundation of Japan, and Kokutai thinking, as well as the world's 8 corners under one roof, so the Hakko Ichiu slogan. He lines up all slogans here that were used at the time and says they're all synonymous with KUA. He says that in this multinational setting, including Manchurians and Chinese, this the KUASIA slogan failed to reach the understanding of the representatives, particularly from the Wang Jingwei government and from the Concordia Society of Manchuria. So he writes, and I quote again, both the Concordia Society of Manchukuo and the representatives of Wang Jingwei's reorganized government have extreme difficulties, in Japanese, kiwamete konnan, in communicating the ideas of kokutai and Japanese spirit to their respective populations, which seems to be a matter of course, but shows, end of quote, of course. So this seems to be a matter of course, but at the same time, it shows how self-centered Japanese Pan-Asianism had become by that time. The author of the report even felt the need to tell his readers that some of the statements that he included in the report from the Chinese side must not be taken as irony, hiniku. He says, the Chinese said this and that, but please don't understand that as irony. They have serious problems to understand the core rhetoric. Concretely, he's here referring to statements such as the reassurance that, and I quote again, even after the successful conclusion of the war and the construction of the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, we will support the Japanese activities to convey the great will of His Majesty, the Japanese Emperor, to the people of East Asia. And of course, the suspicion is not very far-fetched that such a sentence coming from a Chinese representative in 1942 might be considered irony, but I found it very interesting that the Japanese author of this report found it necessary to include in his report of this 1942 conference the warning to his readers, don't take this as irony, it just shows the difficulties the Chinese have to understand what we are trying to tell them. Nevertheless, the idea of Asian solidarity survived the end of the war and the demise of Japan's empire. As early as in 1947, even before India became independent, Jawaharlal Nehru organized the Asian Relations Conference in New Delhi. In 1929, Nehru had still been skeptical of holding a Pan-Asian conference in India, which had been proposed by the Pan-Asiatic Society, which I introduced before, as a follow-up conference to the two conferences in Nagasaki and Shanghai. But Nehru rejected the idea, and the Indian National Congress rejected this idea. The 1947 conference would be later continued with the Colombo and Bandung conferences in the 1950s, and I think we have a presentation about this tomorrow. So I will leave it to this and move on just to explain very shortly the other side of the story. So I have emphasized in this presentation that Pan-Asianism was rarely embraced by governments. It was embraced as a propagandistic tool by the Japanese government in the late 1930s and during World War II. But until then, the Japanese government did not only not embrace Pan-Asianism, it actually actively worked for denying that Japan could ever embrace Pan-Asianism as a foreign policy guideline. I explained before that newspapers all over the world reported about this 1926 conference in Nagasaki, and that some newspapers and politicians in countries or dependencies such as Canada, but also Australia, saw this conference very critically, and they considered it a threat to their future, building upon the trope of the yellow peril. So quite interestingly, in 1926, the Japanese government instructed its foreign representatives, the ambassadors, the envoys, and in some places even the consuls, to make sure that governments do not misunderstand this conference as a sign of Pan-Asianism becoming a Japanese foreign policy guideline. Here, an example from an Australian newspaper, which reports that on the one side, you see the headline, Pan-Asiatics meet in Old Nippon. That's a reference to the Nagasaki conference. And then the subheading is Tokyo message of disclaimer. It's not serious. Don't take that serious. That's the message from the Tokyo government conveyed to Australia by the consul general at the time, a Mr. Tokugawa. This, of course, goes far back, at least to the time of the Russo-Japanese War, if not earlier. So I'm a little bit already over time, I think, but let me just introduce this one quote of a diplomat that the Japanese government sent to Europe at the time of the Russo-Japanese War, arguing very similar ways. In the Russo-Japanese War, it was very important for the Japanese government that European nations do not consider the war between Russia and Japan as a war of the yellow race against the white race. They wanted to prevent that yellow peril propaganda emerges strongly in European countries. So one of these diplomats, Suematsu Kensho, he was specifically sent to Europe to give lectures and talks all over Europe to tell Europeans, don't worry, this is just the Russians versus us. And we have no intention, as you can see from this quote, to create a pan-Asiatic combination. I think I have to come to an end. So maybe instead of a conclusion, let me end with a quote by Rabindranath Tagore, the Indian philosopher, poet, and activist who visited Japan and China several times and was heavily engaged in deepening Japanese-Indian and also Sino-Indian ties since the 1920s. So he kind of can be considered a Pan-Asianist. But his failure to find acceptance both in China and Japan exemplifies why the ideology of Pan-Asianism was, in the last resort, unsuccessful and has been a rather divisive issue until the present day, namely the dominance of nationalism and the hijacking of Pan-Asianism by nationalism. When Tagore gave speeches, his audiences were frequently booing him because he expressed a highly critical attitude towards nationalism. Some scholars have, of course, in more recent years attempted to distinguish between good nationalism from bad nationalism, for example, praising in particular the liberating nationalism of colonized people as a positive force. But Tagore, in general, considered nationalism a Western idea and therefore said Asians should not internalize nationalism because it would destroy their souls and because it would prevent Asian unity, leading to even more internal strife and division. It is well known that Tagore in the 1930s became an outspoken critic of Japanese military expansion in China, but his nationalism critique had already formed by the 1910s when he visited Japan and criticized post-Russo-Japanese War Japan for an exaggerated adoption of the Western idea of the nation, in particular the militarist dimension. So let me end with Tagore's words from 100 years ago, which probably still have some relevance for the understanding of the world we live in today. Nations who sedulously cultivate moral blindness as the cult of patriotism will end their existence in a sudden and violent death. In past ages, we had foreign invasions, but they never touched the soul of the people deeply. To imbue the minds of a whole people with an abnormal vanity of its own superiority, to teach it to take pride in its moral callousness and ill-begotten wealth, to perpetuate humiliation of defeated nations by exhibiting trophies won from war, and using these in schools in order to breed in children's minds contempt for others is imitating the West, where she has a festering sore whose swelling is a swelling of disease eating into its vitality. So if you want to read what is around this, I have not cherry-picked these quotes. You can read this online. Nationalism by Rabindranath Tagore is available on Project Gutenberg and archive.org, for example. So please give this a read. It's a very short piece, but very interesting, partly against the background of the world we are living in today. Okay, thank you for your attention. Sorry for the trouble with the connection and for being over time.